Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengraber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello, could I please speak with Ron Hansen?
This is Ron speaking. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Ron. What a pleasure to have you on the line. I'm so delighted that you're part of the Quarantine Tapes, which is co-presented by Onassis LA and Dublab. Ron, tell me, where do I find you and how have you been living these last 14, nearly 15 delirious months?
Paul, you find me in Taichung City, Taiwan. That's the central city of Taiwan, and well, our experience here has been a little bit different to most people. Actually, until very recently, Taiwan had only experienced 12 deaths this whole pandemic. We hadn't locked down once and had been living a pretty regular life. I mean, the economy was booming. Taiwan was receiving glowing media coverage all over the world. And unfortunately, recently, Taiwan's defenses were finally penetrated, and we are in our first serious outbreak of the pandemic.
What changed?
Well, the two big things happened. First of all, there was a hotel where pilots quarantined, and it turned out this hotel broke the rules by housing regular domestic tourists in the same building as these pilots and aircrew. And then possibly the biggest thing was they reduced the quarantine for pilots and aircrew from 5 days to 3 days. And then suddenly just a whole bunch of them got infected with the UK variant, and they got out and they went around. One of them went to a sports bar and unfortunately it got into the hostess clubs of the Wanhua, the oldest district in Taipei, and then once it got in there, it was pretty well out of control. So as the pandemic has progressed, there's been a lot of knowledge and a lot of discussion, and so while Taiwan was ahead of the game, now we really have some catching up to do because there's only so much energy you can give to a crisis that's happening in other countries. Even myself, I really paid a lot of attention to it, and I'd done a lot of reporting on this in the New Zealand media, and because New Zealand was really studying Taiwan's response and learning from it. And I was really following it. But around December last year, I was just like, you know what, we haven't had any issues here, and I just want to just focus on publishing and the arts,
right, and
studying Chinese.
We'll get to that, but one story I think is so interesting is that the one way in which you prepared was because one doctor was sleepless.
Well, it was fascinating because there was a health official. He had set his alarm for the wrong time by accident, and he woke up early in the morning and he couldn't get back to sleep. So he's scrolling his phone and he goes onto a chat room and he sees some charts and hospital charts that have been originally posted by a doctor from Wuhan, and he looked at it and he thought, well, this looks pretty serious, and so he immediately let the government know, and then literally within hours of that, the government was screening passengers at the airport from Wuhan. And, so the mobilization was instant. And then, of course, this guy became a bit of a hero. And then very shortly after that, Taiwan sent some officials over to China to, get some information. We're not part of the WHO. We're blocked from participating in that and sharing information and so forth. So Taiwan has to be self-reliant. So they sent a couple of people over there to find out what was going on. Very early on, they determined that this was airborne before it had been announced by the WHO. So, we were ready to go here. So it was just, we had this experience with SARS. I was here back in 2003, and it was quite a frightening experience. In the end, the death toll, I think it was 73 people. There's a bit of debate around the death toll, but it was 73 people. It wasn't too many in the end if you compare it to what's happening now. But at the time, we just had no idea of what this was. We had nothing to compare it to. And the only thing we could really think back to was the Spanish flu. And there was little information. So and of course, SARS it turned out to be a much easier virus to stop. But if you got it, the death rate was around 10%. And you had a lot more younger people dying from it. And so, we had a hospital, the epidemic here, the local epidemic, took root in a hospital, Herping Hospital, and they had to lock it down, and it was just chaotic. You had a patient committed suicide, and a nurse tried to jump out of a window, and, doctors and nurses were hanging protest signs out the window, and, between 26 and 34 people died in that hospital, including the head nurse. So everyone in Taiwan, we were all watching this, and the WHO refused to provide Taiwan with information, samples, or tests, and we were left to our own. And suddenly we were the hotspot, with the epicenter, and so it was just this terrible thing of going through this tragedy and just sort of being abandoned by the international community. So
yeah, what I wanted to ask you also, Ron, is before we get to, and I'll just say the name and let everybody sort of look forward to the mystery solved of white fungus. Before we get to that, could you say something to our listeners about, the boom in Taiwan that happened during this pandemic up to this moment, which you're discussing now as being a really challenging moment, of something that's called the Gold Card Program and what it entails?
Yeah, well, because the pandemic had been kept under control here, suddenly there was a desire of a lot of people to move here, a lot of high-skilled people, including Taiwanese who lived abroad. So they had this gold card, which is a visa for highly skilled professionals. And just the numbers of people taking up that, obtaining it, just increased dramatically. So I made a couple of really great friends here who I was actually introduced to via DubLab, and so people were coming here and starting businesses, and the economy grew around 8% in the first quarter here, and last year it was the first time that Taiwan's economy outpaced China in several decades, and so it was just a very exciting time and a real feeling of confidence, and because Taiwan doesn't. Taiwan is diplomatically isolated, and it can't participate in the Olympics under its own name, is excluded from the WHO. And then suddenly, Taiwan was getting all this media coverage, and people were becoming interested in Taiwan. So it was a great experience because, I know for myself, I'm from New Zealand, and all these years, so many people there couldn't even really distinguish between Taiwan and Thailand, and so. Suddenly, the leading epidemiologists in New Zealand were pointing to the Taiwan model, and I was getting invited onto the media and television, radio, print media, and talking about what was going on here. And then suddenly, New Zealand became really interested in Taiwan, and so that was just a great experience. And unfortunately, the stories turn sour, but hey, we're human beings, right? We screw up, we make mistakes, and human folly has a way of finding it, of dominating affairs over time.
Human folly has a long history. Now, Ron, I want to tell you that I'm in reception of an issue of White Fungus, which took me totally, utterly, and delightfully by surprise. And this is a name you gave, and there's a story behind it. You gave to a magazine that you publish that emanates actually from Taiwan. I think brilliant name, because like the bald soprano of UNESCO or some of the most advanced forms of surrealism, one really doesn't know what it might mean. It made me really think of Breton's wonderful line where he said, "The man who cannot visualize a horse galloping on a tomato is an idiot." And here we are with this magazine called White Fungus, filled with strange and wonderful articles. And if you could give our listeners a sense of what might happen if they happen upon an issue of White Fungus, which now I believe has 16 or maybe 17 issues.
Yeah, we're currently working on our 17th print issue, and we've started doing a lot of online publishing during the pandemic. But, we wanted to make a magazine which really gave you no clue on its cover as to what would be inside. We didn't want it to be, so many magazines, you look at it and there's an identification. The magazine almost creates the reader. It almost produces the reader. It's like you're this kind of a reader. Whereas we wanted a magazine to be like the cover. It just had to stimulate the curiosity and compel certain people to begin turning the pages and just to get lost into kind of a kaleidoscopic world and a collision of different ideas and language and art forms. Our most recent issue, number 16, if you flick through it, it begins with an epic article about animal music.
Tremendous, tremendous. It really is tremendous.
That's by a writer in Berlin called Tobias Fischer, and he had co-written a book on the subject, and we just said to him, well, could you crystallize that book into an article? It still ended up being a really long article, and just what the sounds the animals create. Is it purely functional, or is there pleasure involved? Is there creativity that can be compared to what humans do, and how much do we even know about our own creativity? So it just raises all these questions. It starts by talking about the elephant orchestra in Thailand, which is this group of elephants that creates music, and they presented a concert in New York of compositions that have been written down that were produced by the elephants, and they asked the audience, who do you think created this music? And people were like, John Cage, maybe, or so it everyone thought it was. Everyone got.
I have to interrupt you for 1 second. Many years ago, I had the artists Coma and Melamid come. I was working then at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and they had paintings that were done by the tail of elephants, and the same thing happened, Ron. People would say, well, it's hard to say, and then they would name a number of famous, maybe an early Jackson Pollock, but they were not sure.
Well, I think it's a really, it opens up. There's that whole stereotype of people who like to deride abstract painting, saying, well, a monkey could do it or whatever, But what if the monkey was actually a great artist? So it raises a lot of questions. How much do we know about what animals are doing, and what do we have? And in the same issue, just to give you an example of how we have a lot of different content, but there are certain threads that emerge. There's also an interview with Carolee Schneemann. It's a 54-page interview with the, who unfortunately she passed away not long after this interview. It was one of her last major interviews. But she, of course, created artworks which were collaborations with her cats. So I think it's just kind of an interesting thread where you've got these two articles which are very different, but then it ends up just being a thread that runs through them. It's not in terms of genres, it's just sort of themes or ideas that just sort of, we kind of intuitively dive into the material, and then the threads just kind of, they make themselves known as you get deeper into it, and then you try and, as you realize that, you try and accentuate them a little bit and find ways of connecting them. So, and there's also an article by the writer Kurt Gottschalk from New York about a concert of Max Richter's Sleep in New York, where the audience actually the concert happens at night and everyone goes there and actually goes to sleep while the concert happens. And it's just like, and so he talks to different composers about, because it used to be frowned upon, falling asleep in a concert. It was almost like an embarrassing sort of a thing to do. But who's to say sleeping through a concert is any less of an experience than staying awake in the concert? And just so the article just sort of explores the value and whether we should reconsider the way we view something like that. So I guess we're just in a way, all these articles are challenging our perceptions and the way we categorize things, our limitations, and raising doubts about what we do know, and just hopefully just stimulating people into just giving everything a rethink.
You kind of have a tagline for the magazine where you say that it's done in the spirit of pure anarchy, a pseudo-anonymous protest against corporate interests. And I think in a way it delineates perhaps your marching orders. It reminded me of a wonderful publishing house in New York called Akashic Books, and their tagline is reverse gentrification of the literary world. If you had to now in some way say White Fungus after 15, 16 issues, how could you say what it might be? I mean, you have already, of course.
Yes, I mean it's to really come up with a line as good as the one you've just mentioned. I'd need to give it some thought and crystallize it, but it would be hard to do justice to it just by plucking something out of my head in the moment. But certainly it began in the spirit of pure anarchy, because we didn't intend to start a magazine. It was just a sudden decision. We decided it was a protest against a road that was being built in Wellington, New Zealand, which was going to cut through and it did end up cutting through the arts district, destroying heritage buildings and seeing evictions of artists from their studios. So it was just a very spontaneous decision. And of course, we were young and we were energetic and rambunctious. And, you mentioned the avant-garde. I mean, I think that was always our dream, it was early 20th century avant-garde. I remember learning about it in high school and thinking, that's the kind of life I want.
Yes. Without
realizing how hard it would be, of course, and knowing the sort of deprivations that you'd have to go through, or the struggles. But, I mean, the main thing is that, the white fungus that comes from a can, white fungus, which my brother Mark discovered in our local supermarket. And, white fungus is it's a Chinese delicacy. It's often served in soup. It is believed to be good for your skin and for your digestion. And in Chinese, it's has a very benign meaning. But when it gets translated into English, it's jarring and it's unsettling. I mean, certainly when we started the magazine, people were like, why are you calling it this? And
right.
And then I remember an art gallery was going to advertise our second issue, and then they pulled us aside and said, would you consider changing the name of the magazine? Because they liked the magazine and they thought it was great, but they didn't like the name, and we refused, and they withdrew the advertisement. So it was, but we just sort of, I like that idea because, what is it? And by, because is it a fascist magazine? But hang on, a fascist magazine wouldn't call itself White Fungus. And then when you bring in the sort of nutritional value of the actual, the actual organism that it comes from. And I also like the sort of, as a concept for distribution, the idea was we'd just throw the spores to the wind and just sort of see what happened, rather than, finding a market segment and saying, okay, we're going for this kind of person, and we're going to, go through these gates, and we're going to use these codes, and and appeal to whatever gatekeepers we need to appeal to,
right,
to reach that segment. It was more like, let's just throw the spores to the wind, and then just observe the results, and then take it from there.
And then, in a way, Ron, that gesture also is a kind of gesture you make towards the reader, saying,
yes,
I trust you, and I in a way you're enticing people into the unknown. You're saying, let your curiosity lead you and be perplexed by what you might find, because you're going to open this magazine at your risk, and you might find something about animals and music, but you might also happen upon an article about the great Czernovitz poet from Bukovina, where my grandparents were from, an article which is extraordinary about Paul Celan.
I mean, I'm really glad that you enjoyed that article, because we were really excited about publishing it. It's by the New York writer Barry Schwabsky, and we'd had some contact with him, and we were communicating, and he said, "Hey, would you be interested in an article on Paul Celan?" And we weren't really familiar with Celan's work, because I'm not really, I don't read as much poetry as I should, but I had a look at it and thought, wow, this is just incredible stuff. And, the name of the article is Making
great.
the Stone
So great.
Sing.
Yeah, I love it.
And he brings this idea of having to break your teeth on the words as if they're like rocks. I mean, it's, he borrows the idea from the poet Jean Dev. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. And I think the thing with this, because here, you might be reading White Fungus and thinking, wow, these guys they know so much. They're experts on this, they're experts on that. But as I'm revealing to you, I wasn't an expert on it. But I think the point is that what we'd created or facilitated had stimulated something in Barry's mind, where it prompted him to think, hey, well, if there's all this freedom and this sort of stuff flying around, how about this? And so it creates a certain momentum, whereas so we're being surprised. And I like that you say that we trust the reader, because I really feel like we try and meet the reader on a very equal footing. We're not preaching to the reader. We're not teaching them something. We're not sharing our great expertise. We're exploring the world. We're exploring material that we've only just become familiar with ourselves, and through that adventure, we're hoping just for adventurous readers to join us, and then the responses we get from those readers help sort of create the way forward.
Come on a journey with us. It reminds me of another great magazine that comes out of Beirut called Zafar, which you must familiarize yourself with if you don't yet know it, which also you don't know what you will discover. I contributed to it once with a transcript of an interview I did at the New York Public Library with RuPaul, and RuPaul in Beirut. That was really interesting, both to RuPaul and to the readers of Zafar. And when I say trust the reader, it means you trust their curiosity. You trust the fact that people can happen on things the same way your brother happened on a can of white fungus. It comes back to this notion which I adore and which I imagine is not at all strange to you, but rather familiar, which is the notion of walking down a street and bumping into things, which another way of talking about it is digression, and another way of talking about it is just the marvels and the deliciousness of serendipity.
I mean, that's exactly what it's about. I mean, it's just about opening yourself up to this. And because we're in this sort of paradoxical time where we have so much access, and yet at the same time we're at the mercy of these algorithms which are kind of herding us into separate categories and feeding us up things that that meet our expectations. Whereas, so you've got to force yourself, and it's just that it's an old-fashioned concept in a way. Just back when the city was a novel thing, and people, artists and poets would just walk through the streets, and I think for us, because we moved to Taiwan, and it was such a different environment, from New Zealand where we grew up, or other Western countries which we'd spent time in, and that force it dislodged us from our usual patterns, and it just stimulated us and to just exploring things and finding inspiration in the supermarket, or just or a tagline that you find written on a motor scooter. I remember there was one, because back in those days, all the motor scooters had strange little sayings, and there was this one that we really loved. It was, "We reach for the sky and neither does civilization." And we just thought, what is this? Like there was just this haphazard use of English because Taiwan had changed. It had gone from this, the longest period of martial law at that time in world history, since surpassed by Syria, to a democracy, but also into fully fledged consumer capitalism. And there was this rush to use English branding, and so it was so many excellence that you would find, and so you'd see combinations of English words that you just could have never even imagined it. If you had been in an English-speaking setting, you just would have never even thought to put words together in such a way. And then, of course, when we started learning Chinese as well, and that just sort of opens you up to a different approach. And it's also humbling, because when you learn, I've been learning Chinese for a while, and it's still just incredibly humbling, and it just gives us, so I think we just have a different engagement with language. And the other thing is we're outsiders. We grew up in Wellington, New Zealand. We didn't grow up in New York or Los Angeles or Berlin or London, or, we were in Wellington and New Zealand, and then we moved to Taichung City, Taiwan. So we've always kind of been on our own, just in our own world, creating our own worlds. And
what you do reminds me so much of what Vinícius de Moraes, an extraordinary composer, musician, and poet from Brazil. He once said that life is the art of encounter, even though there's so much discord or disencounter throughout life. But life is the art of encounter, and happening upon so happily on White Fungus, that is what happens. It's really an encounter. It's like meeting somebody, bumping into somebody, and discovering something new about them. And I'm wondering, Ron, in closing, if you could tell our listeners how they might come upon White Fungus.
We have a distributor, so we do, when we put out a print issue, we don't put out the print issue very often, and we've got a little bit of trouble at the moment because we're having trouble mailing magazines due to the pandemic. But we do have stores. It is available online, and we're publishing quite a bit of stuff online as well. But you can order it online. And then when we put out we're working on our next print issue. It's going to be, I think, our most surprising issue to date. I won't tell you what's going to be in it, but we've got some pretty unique content that we're working on from Taiwan with stuff that you just can't read about in English. So it's going to be really surprising. And but when it gets into a lot of indie stores, sometimes in galleries, but there is, a bit of serendipity about where readers find it. It's almost, it's strange. It's not patterned. I mean, we often don't, even know where it ends up, but it gets out there, but not in a very orderly fashion.
So it's half a secret.
It is. I think most people who learn about it do learn about it. It is an encounter, and I think often people see it in some odd setting, and it surprises them, and because of that, they have this sort of this individualized, this personal moment with it, and so I think it makes the experience for each reader quite unique. And we're always reaching out because we haven't been in big centres of culture, so we've always had to push the envelope and reach out and see who we can get in contact with and who's open to engaging, so we find people and we try and get a copy to them and just get their response and just see, and then just take it from there. So, but because when you're in a city like Taichung, because we're in an ironic situation because there's not many people in the city who can even read White Fungus, so because it's a difficult read, and for a lot of people, even if English is your first language. I mean, I don't want to say hopefully it's an enjoyable read, but it's challenging material,
it's demanding.
So obviously, if English is if you speak Chinese, then but we're in a weird situation with a very good profile in Taiwan. Everyone knows about it, but because we've had a lot of media coverage here, and we've held a lot of events and done stuff, but we don't have too many people who can read it. But we have done some publishing in Chinese, and we're going to look to do more, I think, in the next year or two. I'd like what I'd really like to do is I'd like to make a publication with just some of our best material and get it translated into Chinese and make something specifically for Taiwan, because Taiwan's been very good for us. So I'd love to make a publication that's specifically designed for Taiwan.
Ron, we will include in the notes to this program whose hunger might be, their appetite might be open now to reading and encountering white fungus, will make available how they might find it. But I must thank you now, really. It's been a joy to talk to you, and as I said, I learned a lot from the various issues. I read one online, the most recent one, and issue number 15, which thankfully I now possess. So I'm really, really grateful to you, and as I said, I really loved your piece on Porzellan, and it reminded me of a line of his that I've always treasured, where he says that poetry is sort of a homecoming.
Wow, that's amazing. That's a great way to end, and thank you, Paul. And I'm blown away by how well you seem to understand what we're trying to do. Maybe you understand it better than we do. So I appreciate that.
All the very best to you.
You too.
Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.